Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Wildlife for Lunch. Today's presentation is going to cover small acreage wildlife management, and it is presented by Rufus Stephens, the district leader for the Edwards Plateau Wildlife District at Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. Today's Wildlife for Lunch is hosted by the Texas Wildlife Association and Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. And Wildlife for Lunch is made possible through funding provided by the San Antonio Livestock Exposition, Inc. All right, so with that, I'm going to pass the presentation over to Rufus, and let me just set this up. All right, there you go.
Thank you, Eleanor. What we're going to talk about today is small acreage wildlife management. We might think of it as good habitat in small packages. What we're going to cover today is we're going to talk a little bit about what small acreage is, and we're also going to talk about what is your current land use, what is the type of land use you have on your property, what type of habitat do you have, and then what will you manage for. And on small acreage, people often think of things like, some of the larger animals like deer. We're going to focus on birds, as that's an example of something that no matter the size that you have, that can be something that everybody can manage for. And also it's often what people see in their property as some of the values that they have there are the birds that they have on their property. So we're going to talk about that, but we're going to get back and talk a little bit about deer and how it relates to small acreage. And then we're going to talk about management practices appropriate for small acreage. And that's kind of, I think, sort of kind of the meat of it, but we got to just cover a little bit of these other aspects of it. So we're going to start by talking about what is small acreage. And it depends, but oftentimes it's thought of as between 1 and 250 acres, and it depends on the part of the state that you're in. So 250 acres in East Texas is maybe considered not small acreage. It may be large, but in West Texas that would probably be considered small acreage. So and it also depends on the type of habitat that you have, and so, or the potential that you have. So, and back to my example in West Texas, 250 acres is pretty tough to, you're not going to have a lot of wildlife on it. Just the productivity of it in West Texas is going to limit the wildlife that you can have. But in East Texas, even a very small amount of acreage can be provide some excellent wildlife habitat. One thing I'm going to throw in here is if you're considering buying small acreage, an important consideration is the past land history and the potential for tax issues. And what I'm talking about here is whether it has a current ag valuation and how you might maintain that into the future, and that has particular property tax ramifications. So that's one of the things to consider. So if you're considering buying some acreage and you don't already have it, that can be one of the things that I'd encourage you to ask about during the purchasing process. And then additionally is the quality of the current habitat. And I can't tell you how many times I've had landowners come to me and say, well, I bought a piece of property, a small piece of property, and we've gone in and cleared everything but the live oaks, and now we're ready and we want to talk about wildlife habitat. Well, they lost a lot of that habitat initially. So take your time and learn about the habitat that's on your property before you do too much manipulation, because some of the habitat that may be there that's of high quality could potentially be lost when you use particular practices. Next, what kind of what's the current land use for your property? So what do you have? Is it timber? Is it farming land, cropland, or is it rangeland or grassland? And there are certainly going to be properties that have a combination of these. So, you know, in Central Texas, it might be a combination of cropland and grassland. In East Texas, it could be dominated by woodlands or timber. And as we move out into the western part of the state, it may be really dominated by rangeland. So that's kind of what I'm talking about as far as what's the current land use. So next is what type of habitat do we have? We might divide this up. This is kind of just broad categories: grasslands, woodlands, savanna, which is more of an open woodland. It's often, where's the dividing line between grasslands and savanna, or a savanna and a woodlands, and it just has to do with how many trees there might be on the property. So in a particular area. So a savanna is kind of, you might just think about it as an equal mix of mature trees and grass intermixed. Then riparian habitat, and riparian is a term that we use. We're talking about creeks and streams and the associated adjacent habitat. And these can be everything from a perennial river, stream, to a seasonal draw. So as long as it's growing a different type of vegetation from the surrounding uplands. So that's riparian habitat. And then wetland habitat. And it'd be nice if everybody had some had wetland habitat, whether that's springs or seeps, or a coastal marsh, or a playa lake in the Panhandle. But here's some examples of you know, the grassland type situation. And as I mentioned before, here's another grassland, more of an East Texas grassland, and it may be more of a pocket surrounded by woodland. So often you're going to have multiple habitats intermixed, and actually even in this slide you can see that there's a tank or pond in the background so they obviously have water as well. So there's several really habitat types in this photo. Maybe woodland, and that woodland may be composed of a variety of different plant communities or different species, woody plant species, and then riparian habitat. And it'd be awesome if we all had riparian habitat that looked like this, but that's a good example of riparian habitat and the variety of plants that can grow along those. And as I mentioned, wetlands. And speaking of playa lakes, as an example, this is a playa up in the Panhandle part of the state. So you might be lucky enough to have that. And then, of course, I mean, when we think of wetlands, I mean, sort of there's some ponds can, or at least portions of our ponds or tanks can have wetland type characteristics, and so that's one thing to kind of keep in mind is there might be even parts of your tank, the upper end of your tank, shallow parts of your tank that can serve kind of like a wetland habitat. So one of the really important things to think about is the structure of the habitat, and we're going to go into this in a little bit more detail, and to a great extent, this is what you're managing for when you're using different management practices, is to try to improve add understory, try to manage for grassland communities or whatever, but manage for these varieties, diversity of layers in your habitat. And so that's really an important component. It's kind of thinking about where your habitat's healthy and what might be lacking. Let me try to use the, maybe I'll use the pen here. And so, you know, so we're talking about this type of habitat is often one that is that's often missing and needs some attention. So, so let's talk about woodlands a little bit. And canopy or large trees, that would be sort of the dominant aspect. What would make it a woodland would be large trees and an overstory of a canopy of large trees. And then you have a mid-story of smaller trees, and then we get into understory, shrubs, and as I just mentioned, these are something that are often can be impacted and lacking, and something that we may want to focus on from a management perspective, and including ground cover. And this can be things like grasses and of course, a term that we use, forbs, for flowering plants. We're going to talk a little bit more about that here in just a second. And vines are all kind of down at that level. And as I mentioned, the understory and ground cover is often in our woodlands an area that really does need attention, and that may be the focus of our management. Well, what are some of the birds? I mentioned that birds are going to be what we're going to kind of focus on here today from a management perspective on small acreage. And here's some examples of woodland birds, and these are predominantly for Central Texas, although things like white-eyed vireos and yellow-billed cuckoos are something that we have in East Texas as well, where things like scrub jays and Scott's orioles are more common in the western parts of the state. So there's some examples there that would apply across the state. Woodlands are often associated with woodpeckers, and so that's, you know, one of the types of wildlife that we may be interested in managing for in those areas. Other woodland birds are things like this Bullock's oriole and the cedar waxwing are also woodland species. Some of the plants that we might be interested, or the plants that may be lacking that understory. So I'm going to just mention a few of those kind of understory plants that we might be thinking about. As again, I mentioned those may be where our management focus is and trying to encourage those. Some of those can be things like elbow bush, American beautyberry, red buckeye, maybe one of those. And as I mentioned, you know, we were talking a little bit about vines, things like Carolina snailseed, often overlooked as a very valuable wildlife plant. So that's a little bit about woodlands and some of the habitats and the structure that we'd have there. So let's talk a little bit about grasslands, and basically they're dominated by herbaceous cover, grasses and forbs, and as I mentioned, forbs, broadleaf flowering plants, and basically we're talking about annuals and perennials. This is important as we move forward and talk about management, that whether we're talking about managing for annuals or perennials, forbs, and some of the strategies to do that. And really often we want to try to manage for a mix of those. And so that'll come up in our management a little bit later. Also on grassland, invaders, woody plants are often invaders on grasslands, and that's something to be focused on and understand the relationship of woody plants coming into a grassland setting. So in the hill country we have, you know, ash juniper, but in East Texas it could be yopon and so there are a variety of different woody plants that can be a problem for grasslands. some of the grassland birds that we might be interested in managing for: meadowlarks, eastern or western meadowlarks, things like dickthistles, scissortails, wild turkey. One that I don't have on here is a quail, so that would be another grassland bird that's that we might be interested in managing for. So these are all some grassland birds that we might be interested in managing for. Here's one that is very popular with a lot of people kind of in the eastern half of the state, is the eastern bluebird, and lots of people manage for eastern bluebirds, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move forward. Or scissortails, and very beautiful flycatcher, and I think a bird that a lot of people would just really enjoy having. Grasslands, and so by its very name, we think of grass, but there's actually a variety of habitat that would be there, and including, and as I mentioned earlier, is talking about the composition of other things besides grasses, the herbaceous cover, including perennials, and here's some examples of some mainly perennials, things like England daisy and the penstemons here in this photo. Or it may also be managing, or another component is the annual forbs, so things like bluebonnets and paintbrushes and such as that. So a grassland community, a healthy grassland community, is going to have a variety of those. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about riparian habitat. And like with woodlands, we have an overstory, a canopy of large trees, a mid-story of small trees, but maybe the most important, and often where we're going to focus on from a management perspective, is the understory and the impact that may have occurred in the understory, and that's, you know, the shrubs and the ground cover, herbaceous and plants there. Some riparian birds. Again, yellow-billed cuckoo, white-eyed vireo, not only woodland bird, but also an important riparian bird in the eastern half of the state. Other birds like black-crested titmice in the hill country, and chickadees, Buick's, wrens, a little bit more west. So there's an example of some riparian birds that we might be interested in managing for. And riparian habitat, as I mentioned, that variety that's there, and herbaceous and woody plants, including those that may be, you know, low-growing, not necessarily the tall trees, but small trees and shrubs that we may have lost there. So that's important to have and to be looking at as far as quality is concerned. Some of the species that we might have in those areas, things like roughleaf dogwood, buttonbush, which is found throughout East Texas and into Central Texas in riparian habitats. Now, so we talked about what type of habitat you might have, and so let's talk a little bit about what you might manage for. And as we mentioned, birds is an easy focus for a small acreage. It's, again, what people think about and often can relate to as the wildlife value that they have on their small acreage. So let's look at the different types of habitat and how birds might relate to this. And in this just diagram I've got here, we have woodlands represented by the green area, this kind of patchy area down here we have that we're going to call shrubland or savanna. That sort of blue line, up the line through the middle, that's going to be our riparian habitat. And then on the right-hand side, we got our grassland habitat. And if we think about how birds might utilize these different habitat types, for instance, eastern bluebirds would be not only using the riparian habitat and grassland habitat, but also would be found in the shrub or savanna habitat, not so much in the woodland habitat. So that species is associated with and would be found in that habitat. An example in the hill country of a bird that's really associated with dense woodlands is golden-cheeked warblers, but there could be a variety of woodland-specific birds, but they're in the case of golden cheeks, that's their primary area for nesting in their primary habitat area. Another good example for the hill country is a green kingfisher, really associated with riparian or streamside habitat, and really not found in any of the other adjacent areas. So that would be specific to the riparian habitat. Scissortails we might think of as kind of a little bit of overlap depending on the type of riparian habitat might be there. It actually may be, depending on how open the savanna habitat is, we might have some scissortail, but it's much more of a grassland bird. In the hill country, a very bird that's very much associated with and uses savanna shrubland, or more of a shrubland habitat, is black-capped vireo, and it's really not associated with woodlands or grasslands per se. And then we have something like the red-shouldered hawk that may be utilizing all of these areas. The grasslands, the riparian areas, it could be nesting and probably nesting in riparian areas, but in searching for food, it's going to be in grasslands, woodlands, and shrublands. So with that, you start thinking about how these different species are overlapping and using the different habitat types. So that's an important way to kind of think about how the different birds are utilizing and where they may be limited to a particular habitat type. Another way to look at that in a little different setting, this is eastern bluebird in central Texas, and just showing some use there of bluebirds. Actually, this is some information from the Cibolo Nature Center from their monitoring of nest boxes, and what they found was that the prairie by far was preferred by the bluebirds. Didn't mean they didn't use the woodlands or the creek habitat or riparian habitat or marsh area that they had, but they mainly used the prairie habitat. And then we look at another species, the Carolina wren, and it did not use, it's kind of reversed, it was more common in creek and woodland habitats and not so much in the prairie or marsh. So different birds are utilizing different habitat types, and we need to kind of recognize that when we're managing for these species. And let me back up and just say a little bit about information. Well, where do we get this kind of information about the different types of habitat that these birds might be using? And I'll just give you one resource that you might want to utilize, and that's All About Birds, an online resource through Cornell, and that can be a good resource for finding out about different habitats that they use, where they would be using those, what the kinds of food sources they would be using. So there's some pretty good online resources for helping you kind of figure out how those birds may be using and what they're dependent upon in your habitat. So So let's get into the meat of this, the management practices. need to understand a few things, and the basic components of habitat that we talk about is food, water, shelter, and space. We often combine shelter and space and just refer to that as cover. So oftentimes we just talk about food, water, and cover as the basic components of habitat. And some kind of key concepts to keep in mind. Some of it I've already talked about, but diversity, it's a good way to kind of think about it as diversity equals diversity. The greater variety of habitat, of plants that you have in your habitat, and other types of wildlife, and we'll talk a little bit more about that too, the greater diversity of wildlife you can attract. So in most cases, diversity equals diversity. So that's a good concept to keep in mind. Another one is the structure for the habitat, excuse me, the structure of the habitat, and I already talked a little bit about that, those important variety of layers, and what layers might be missing, and that's an important concept to be thinking about. Another one is year-round food. You may have lots of a spring food source or a summer food source, but do you have a good fall food source or winter food source? You want to think about whether you have food availability year-round. So if you've got some gaps, that can be an area of focus for your management practices. The same is true of year-round cover. So do you have cover that's available at all times of the year? Oftentimes, evergreen plants, some evergreen plants are important to be able to provide winter cover. And sort of lastly, an important focus is on native plants. Native wildlife, native birds, native insects are adapted to the native plants, and that's what we want to really focus on, is on native plants. Different types of foods, some of the native food sources. Fruits is one type of food source that we might have. Seeds, those are some pretty obvious ones. Maybe less obvious is mass, which there's actually soft mass and hard mass, but even if we just talk about things like acorns or nuts, combine that terminology, the acorns and nuts together, we're talking about mass. And so there are some actual soft mass like prickly pear. So that's a food source as well, and one that's kind of often overlooked, maybe not if you have hummingbirds, but is nectar as a food source as well. And so we want to kind of keep all of these food sources in mind, and whether we have them on a year-round basis. And as an example of that, here's some fruiting plants that we have in Central Texas, and some of these plants in other areas. But just as an example, in the upper left-hand corner is agarita, and below that's American beautyberry, or let me start with agarita, and agarita is a good late spring food source. And on the upper right is lantana, which is a good summer food source. And then the American beautyberry is a fall, and possum haw, or deciduous yaupon, as a winter food source. And so just with those 4 plants, we've begun to address a year-round food supply. So in your area, there will be plants as well that can be providing those from a year-round standpoint, and looking at your habitat and trying to decide which ones may be lacking, what time of the year you don't have enough fruiting or enough seed sources, and that may be something to address. Other types of food sources that we may not be thinking about. Small mammals, if we're talking about managing for hawks, raptors, then small mammals may be an important part of what we're managing for in order to provide a food source. Lizards and snakes. Oftentimes people say, oh, I'm interested in managing for roadrunners. I really like roadrunners. Well, roadrunners they love lizards and snakes, and so you got to think about whether those are available. So, and probably most important and often overlooked is insects. And especially for birds, insects are really, really important. Insects are something that we often kind of get the feeling that they're out to get us, so we're often in a intense control measure, spraying death and destruction to try to get rid of those insects. But we need to realize that they are an incredible part of the food source available to wildlife, especially birds, and even birds that we think of as seed-eating birds, say, for example, as simple as a cardinal. During the spring, when they're raising their young, this time of year, they're using a tremendous amount of insects. So insects are important to a vast majority of our birds as a food source. So we need to be thinking about that as a important food source. So as far as the shelter and cover, so we talked a little bit about food. So shelter and cover, there's basically nesting cover and escape or protective cover when we talk about shelter and cover. And nesting cover is often, again, those horizontal layers. For instance, painted buntings will nest up to about 6 feet off the ground, but so if you're missing those lower levels, then you've lost their nesting habitat. And also, shrubs and grasses can be incredibly important in providing important nesting cover. Snags can be important, which are standing dead trees, and actually with the drought, we have maybe a lot more snags than we had in the past, and that may be something that we really want to try to maintain, so not removing all of them. So that's something to think about with maybe some drought-killed trees. Escape or protected cover, horizontal layers, again, is really important. Snags, again, are important as escape and protected cover for certain types of wildlife. But so are brush piles, and again, that year-round, do we have something that's evergreen to provide winter cover when in the dormant season? So those are important things to consider there. Again, there's our variety of layers, and not only do we want to have those variety of layers for nesting and escape cover, but also evergreen plants in there as winter cover. So let's talk a little bit about the management in different areas. We're going to start by talking about woodlands and riparian areas. Managing, one of the important things may be in your property, even though deer may not be the focus of your management, they may be important as a browser and an animal to control. So while it may not be that on small acreage, 10 or 20 or 50 acre piece that you can really manage for, trophy deer or something like that, it can be incredibly important to control the deer population in those areas because they may be having as much impact on your habitat as some of the habitat management practices that you're doing. So controlling deer may be an important part of managing for small acreage for managing small acreage for wildlife. Controlling grazing. And we talked a little bit about grazing as part of your property if you're going to maybe have an ag valuation. So, but managing that grazing can be incredibly important in controlling the and managing that habitat. And as I've mentioned several times already, is increasing and managing the understory is an important component in woodland and riparian systems. And both deer and grazers can have a significant impact on that. And obviously, some of the birds that we're talking about are things like woodland birds. But not to overlook, again, are the insectivorous birds and the food sources that they need. So deer management, that can be an important part of small acreage management, mainly for how the deer impact and have impact on our habitat. And so that can often be the focus of it's an important tool of management on small acreage, is controlling that deer population. Grazing systems, and just going to talk about just a couple. There's a lot of different grazing systems out there, and as an example, one might be that can be applied on smaller acreage, might be as simple as a 2-pasture, 1-herd, where basically you have the animals and you have 2 pastures and you move them back and forth between those 2 pastures. It may require some deferred grazing, taking the animals off for a while. It can be beneficial to, for example, that type of deferred grazing or the 2-pasture system to things like black-cat vireos. But and it doesn't require a lot of fencing from that perspective. But more common, and probably as we move into more pastures, and in this scenario, a 4-pasture, 1-herd, that rotation gives you a lot more benefit from the benefits of grazing, but then an extended period of rest. And you may say, well, I've got a small piece of property, and how can I possibly do grazing? Well, one is to maybe do it as a co-op, maybe work with your neighbors and that your property ends up being like one pasture, and your neighbors is another pasture, and so you work together, and you may rotate those animals between your different properties just as if they were pastures. So that's one way to think about it. You don't have to have all the pastures on your property and still get some of those benefits that would be derived from grazing. So so that's an option for smaller acreage. To look at sort of grazing systems and kind of how they work, and so this would be an example of a 1-pasture or a 4-pasture, 1-herd, and that you have January and February, or January through April, one of the pastures grazed, then you move into the next one from May to August, and then you get to the next one in September through December, and one pasture was basically rested throughout that growing season, but that's the next pasture you move into. So the second year, that's your January and April. Now this staggered approach means that you're not moving into the same pasture every year at the same time every year. And so that you get extended periods of rest, but not only when you're grazing it is a staggered time, so it's not always in the spring, it's not always in the summer, and so that changes over the years. And that can really help in managing for a diversity of plants, especially annuals and perennials will be influenced by the time of year that the grazing occurs. So by staggering it, you really get a great benefit from it. Woodlands, oftentimes, brush control may be required as part of maintaining that woodland, and that can be combined to utilize brush piles. And in this example, you can kind of see that there's not a lot of understory, and by utilizing, actually this is drought-killed trees that the landowner was removing that was near a fence, and so they utilized some of the smaller branches to create a brush pile where they were kind of lacking some understory. So this served that purpose of sort of adding some understory for that area by utilizing a brush pile. So it's a combination of things. You can use it, not only are you accomplishing some brush management, but you're also not taking it completely away and allowing it to may meet one of your lacking needs, which might be a need for more understory. And let me back up. And mention that again. This was a drought-killed tree, and as I mentioned earlier when we were talking about snags, the 2011, especially in Central Texas, we lost a lot of trees. But I know in other parts of the state they lost trees as well, and so consider that carefully before you remove all those standing dead trees, because they are very important to a variety of wildlife. And so think about how you may not need all those trees standing, but be careful about how many you remove, because they can be very important habitat for a variety of birds. We've already talked about woodpeckers. Actually, any of our cavity nesting birds, their natural sources of cavities are often coming from snags, where woodpeckers make a surplus of holes, and the wildlife utilize that. So nest boxes can be a way to kind of supplement that lack of snags, and an important aspect of that is to keep records. And that, as I showed you with the Nature Center, that kind of, the Cibolo Nature Center, some of their records helped them figure out where the different birds were utilizing different habitats. And so if you keep good records, that can really help you identify some of those characteristics. So let's move on to grassland or cropland management for wildlife. And you know, one of the important, oftentimes one of the ways that people will want to manage on small acreage is using mowing or baling. And we'll talk a little bit about that. One of the things that's really important about managing a grassland or cropland area is to limit the amount that you manage in any one year. I usually recommend a third, and in a couple slides we'll see an example of that, where I go into a little bit more detail about that. Timing is very important. When you do your mowing or baling or prescribed burn, will influence the types of plants that come up and how the plants respond, whether that's setting back perennial warm season grasses, or encouraging annual forbs or perennial forbs. Timing is critical. And what I just referred to is improving that diversity of grasses and forbs. This is really our goal in managing these areas. And some of the species that we think about in these settings are things like ground nesting birds and insectivorous birds. But not only that, but including things like winter grassland birds is important. And as and another thing that I mentioned earlier was raptors. So if we're talking about managing grasslands, oftentimes we're talking about managing for small rodents as part of managing for raptors and benefiting things like red-shouldered hawks or red-tailed hawks. Here's an example of sort of when you're using mowing. In the upper left-hand slide, you can see where an area that has been mowed and an area that has not been mowed, and you end up removing a lot of that standing dead material that's and cutting it down with mowing or baling. There's an example of that. A little closer look at that. But one of the problems is that you tend to take that litter and all that material that was standing above, and you throw it on the ground, and that limits can limit the growth of plants that are on the ground, especially annuals specifically, but also even perennials. And you can see this is an early spring shot, and you can see there's just not a lot of plants. There's a few green plants coming up in there, but not a lot. It's being limited by that all that grass that's been thrown down. So, as an alternative, is to bale, to remove some of that standing material, so you don't throw it all on the ground, and that can help to some, but it's And that's the purpose of baling in this type of situation. Other areas, cropland areas that we might manage for, things like dove, so doing fallow disking and such to encourage things like annual sunflowers. And as you can see, our native annual sunflowers make a very small seed. There's seeds in actually in my hand there, and disking, allowing them to come up in this time of year in the spring and summer, and then go to seed as a food source. That kind of annual disking can be a way to encourage this type of food source. Prescribed burning, I touched on, it can be a challenge on smaller acreage, but if you have the opportunity to do it, I'd encourage you to utilize prescribed burning. I encourage you to use the expertise of organizations like Parks and Wildlife or NRCS or Extension Service in helping you to do this safely. But it can be a really incredible tool for management of wildlife. Here's an example just shortly after a burn of white-crowned sparrow, utilizing that burned habitat. So that's really can be very important. Here's an example after a burn, and again, you see that all that litter that would be thrown down in a mowing with prescribed burn is consumed. And this is just a couple months, or actually a few weeks later, about 6 weeks later, that same area is, regrowing very successfully. A lot of maximine sunflower in there. Here's an example of the benefits that a burn will have. And this was some information that was collected at the Cibolo Nature Center. And this is pretty well known that when you burn, you're going to increase forbs and decrease bare ground. So the amount of bare ground went up dramatically after the burn, and the amount of forbs goes up, and grasses goes down some. But then post-burn, as years go on, the amount of bare ground disappears. We get a lot of litter. The amount of forbs can go down, and grasses increase. And so that's one of the things we're trying to manage, that balance of those different plants. Again, there's a shot after a burn, lots of bare ground for forbs to regenerate in. And at the Nature Center, they also did some work with mowing, and you can see a little bit of a response after, or very little response after mowing. But when they did a little bit of baling, they got some, but not like prescribed burning, but they got a little bit of response and an increase in bare ground and an increase in forbs. So as opposed to mowing alone, baling can be important. Again, there's all that litter that you're trying to manage. So as an example, one of the things I encourage is thinking about it from a prairie calendar. And if you're managing for grasses, only do one of these activities per year. And basically in the early spring and in the midsummer, in this area right in here, we're talking about birds nesting, and so we want to avoid doing any mowing or baling at that time of year. If we're going to only do it at one time of year, and we want it to be maybe in the midsummer, that's the time we want to do it. We want to do it just that once, and then not come back to that location until the following year. And you want to mow it as high as possible, but you want to be after that point where the birds are nesting. And you also want to limit the area, so preferably only a third if you're going to use mowing as a practice, or baling, haying, is to only do it once, and to only do it to a third of the area in any given year. you probably have more benefit. And actually, this time of year to mow will set back warm season grasses, where if you do it in the wintertime and the dormant season, it's a way to improve those warm season grasses. So you got to think about whether you're trying to set back some of your warm season grasses or not. The next is talking about using mowing to encourage annual wildflowers, basically to encourage the forbs, setback grasses, and I tend to call this the TxDOT approach. And if you think about the highway department and how they manage those areas, they wait for the wildflowers to go to bloom. So we're talking about late June, early July, maybe even after the 4th of July. And then after those wildflowers have gone to seed, those forbs have gone to seed, then they begin mowing, and they mow 2 or 3, 4 times before the dormant season, and then they stop. And then during the winter, they don't do any mowing, and all through the summer. Again, don't do any more than maybe a third of the area. And what this does is it encourages and increases insects and forbs, the insects that are living on those forbs, and can make great brood habitat. So it's a way to add diversity to your grassland area. So let me talk a little bit about water. We're going to wrap up here. I'm going to go through a couple things here real quick. Water sources, and let me back up. So there's natural sources, but there's also things like tanks and ponds are a supplemental way, and we may have water troughs. And we're going to talk a little bit about guzzlers. And so we might have a tank or a pond and managing that. And one of the things to think about is actually in the previous slide, you can see the pretty bare shore. And so to increase the cover, maybe to either fence part of that or all of it, and increase the cover that's available there. You might only fence part of it if you're using it as a water source for cattle, but fencing it off can really increase the habitat value of that tank or pond. Water troughs, oftentimes they're very steep-sided, like this picture here, and one of the things to think about is a ramp to be able to allow wildlife to safely get in, utilize that. A hardware cloth ramp can easily be made to make this water source much more available to the wildlife. Here's some more examples of different types of ramps. It can be as simple as putting cinder blocks or rock in a shallow trough to make it more accessible, but it could be hardware cloth, it could be a variety of things. Guzzlers. Basically, these are water catchment devices, and there's basically 3 parts of it. One is the catchment area, so how you catch the rain. The other is the storage of that rainfall, and then the lastly is the delivery. And if you kind of think about it that way, there are just a number of different ways to be able to accomplish that. So here's the catchment area here on this one right here, and then actually there's 2 55-gallon drums down here on the bottom, and that's your storage area. And also your delivery location. And this is kind of a basic guzzler design. There's the 55-gallon drums, either welded together or if they're plastic, connected with PVC, and then a trough, this cutout, or the ramp. This cutout end over here, you use that trough, the ramp, you set it in here, and you make that not only your storage, but your delivery as well. One of the important things is making sure if you buy if you're buying 55-gallon drums, make sure they're food quality 55-gallon drums, that they had food, not petroleum products stored in. Here's another guzzler. Again, catchment area, storage tank, and then actually this goes off into a delivery system elsewhere. So you start realizing there's a lot of different ways to accomplish this same thing. So guzzlers can be a neat way to add a water source. A couple of other things that we're going to finish up with is predator control. Brown-headed cowbirds can be a serious nest predator. parasite on songbirds, and so controlling brown-headed cowbirds may be one of the things that you're interested in doing as part of that. And if you got a hog problem, you may need to control your hogs. AgriLife Extension has a lot of great new publications on a variety of techniques, and with technologies, there's a lot of new stuff coming out that's making trapping and things like trail cameras, apps to control gates on traps that you can trigger with your phone. So there's a lot of different things that are coming out to hopefully help us get a better handle on hogs. So just wrap it up. Small acreage management. We talked about what small acreage was, what your current land use might be, the types of habitat that you have, what you might manage for, and our focus here today was on songbirds and some of the management practices that we could use. Want to recognize the photo credits from these folks, and I want to recognize, as I do all my presentations, I dedicate them to the memory of my son. And with that, there's my contact information, email address, and phone number. If you got any, and be happy to take some questions now. I know we're right up against the 1 o'clock time, but I'm sure that we can take a few questions, and I'd be happy to try to address some of those.
All right, thank you, Rufus.
Well,
we do actually have a question that came up during the program. Somebody asked, if I go to 1D1 wildlife management from native grassland, can I go back to native grassland again in the future without penalty?
Yeah, if you're doing it, so what they're saying is if you're using livestock grazing and you go from, actually it's the same type, it's just a different version of the ag to go to wildlife. But if you go to wildlife and you decide that you want to go back to ag, you can absolutely do that. You can switch back and forth. I wouldn't do it on an annual basis, go back and forth, but you can certainly, it's not a one-way street. So if you go from traditional ag and using livestock to go wildlife valuation, you can also go back if you decide that it's not for you.
All right, thank you. And I'm not seeing any more questions right now, so if anyone does have a question, please post that in the chat window here. Oh, someone has, what's the address for the hog control info? Just send them to AgriLife. Is there a...
Absolutely. I think if you just go to AgriLife and then you put in feral hogs, you'll get all their information. They've got some on using corral traps on, and they got several different, 3 or 4 new publications that are excellent.
All right. And next question is, can we control grackles as well as brown-headed cowbirds?
That's a good question. I'm thinking that no, it's not, but that's a good question, and I might not be able to answer that. So any exotic birds, starlings, house sparrows, can be controlled, but I don't know about grackles. That's a good question.
All right. The next question is, where's the best place to acquire the native annual sunflowers? Will disking alone encourage them?
Oftentimes, disking alone will encourage them, but if you want to supplement it, many of the seed companies that are out there provide, and what you want to get is annual native sunflower, many of the seed companies across the state, that's a very common seed source to have. So it's widely available.
All right. All right, the next question is, someone says, I'm having trouble with Siniso taking over and choking out other plants. Common herbicides don't kill it, and spike is cost prohibitive. When we chop it out, it comes right back. Do you have any ideas?
Oh, that's a good one as well. Bob Lyons with AgriLife Extension is really an expert on chemical control of woody plants, and there are some that can be very difficult to control. The only other thing that I would, and some of it may be that you manage not whether you have it at all, but the height of it, and it may be that utilizing things like prescribed burning can help set it back. It's not that you're going to kill it, but set it back so that you get a little bit more diversity, and it may just be managing the height of that rather than thinking you're going to be able to get rid of it. But AgriLife Extension has got some excellent, and Bob Lyons with AgriLife is an excellent resource.
All right. Somebody else was just having a follow-up, I believe, about the grackle question. They're saying generally it is legal and okay to kill them in Texas if they're causing a nuisance or health hazard. While they're not exotic and are still technically protected from sport or fun shooting, many would consider them constantly a nuisance, and in that case they may be controlled by killing as approved by both state and federal law. This is summarized from state law on the TPWD website. So that's just kind of a follow-up comment to that question about the grackles.
Thank you.
If anyone else has any questions, please continue to post them in the chat window. And just want to mention that this will be available on our website as well. I'm going to try and get it put up early next week sometime. So if anybody missed part of the presentation or wants to see any more, then this will be available on our website. And not seeing any more questions for right now. Our next Wildlife for Lunch webinar will be on July 18th, and that will cover water for wildlife. And our presenter next month is Steve Nelly. So for those of you who are regularly come to these, that will be our next program. I'm not seeing any more questions, so someone just posted Bob Lyons information, so that's good. Here's another one. All right, if I wanted to experiment with fertilizing native brush, can you suggest a rate per acre of fertilizer and a formula?
Yeah, no, I can't. That would be something that, again, that would be AgriLife Extension. They could absolutely do that for you, is come up with a fertilizer rate for that. But that's not something we normally do. So we would defer to AgriLife.
All right, then, and then, like I said, I'm not seeing any more questions, so please post if you have any more. But I think we're kind of nearing the end here, so thank you so much, Rufus, for coming and helping us out with this today.
You bet. I appreciate it, Eleanor. Thank you.
Yeah, some good information there. So if there's no more questions, if you have one, type it quickly, because if there's no more questions, then I think we're about ready to close out. So I'm not seeing any more coming in. So thank you again, and
you bet. And thank you, and thanks to TWA for doing this, and thanks for all the attendees for coming in.
Oh yeah, definitely. All right. Well, thank you so much. I'll talk to you later. All right.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Bye bye.